Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and talking on a topic that is very close to my heart and to my head, so to speak, intellectual as well, something that I find particularly perplexing, and that's the recent changes in the global political order and the impact that has on us as Christians or Christian communities. Now, of course, I understand that you are also interested in the state of the Pathways to Peace initiative. But I really think that the global geopolitical situation is one of the most decisive factors that impacts the success or failure of that initiative. Questions like the recent bombardment of Iran by Israel, the current views of President Donald Trump, or even the production chains for drones. All these questions and the changes of them have far-reaching consequences for not only the Russian-Ukrainian war, but also for the prospects of peace in general. So I want to take a step back from the concrete situation surrounding the Russian war on Ukraine and instead think about the many dramatic changes in global politics recently, and about the decline of the global political order. And we have to be very frank about that what we are witnessing is indeed a decline, a quite steep decline of the global political order, and about what all that means for us as Christians and for the ways we react to these developments. Now, of course, to say that we are living in turbulent times sounds like a platitude, but I think that everyone who is following global politics must admit that recently the transformation of global politics has started accelerating dramatically, and not always for the better. And this means that we as Christians and representatives of Christian communities, but also simply as human beings who share this planet with others, need to draw conclusions from these novel circumstances. We need to ask again what it means for us to respond in a way that carries forward the good news about God's salvific plan and about peace, but also taking it into account new developments that make the global picture, more complex by the day. What does it mean to act responsibly and with loving hearts when responding to events in which key principles we want to adhere to are clashing? And as I'll show, that may be often the case. What do we do when facing developments or events which we believed until quite recently the humankind has grown out of? So the purpose of this talk, at least as I understand it, is not to give correct, quote unquote, correct answers about what we are supposed to do within the pathways to peace, or more generally. It is important to realize that possible Christian responses to war or many other political events may significantly differ depending on our experiences, on the charisms of our communities, and of course, also on the historical heritages of our traditions. So instead, what I'd like to do is to flag those developments that have the potential to transform global politics most dramatically, and that may also pose a challenge for the received wisdom about how we Christians should respond to these events. So this intervention of mine is not so much about what Christians should do, but rather about flagging those global shifts which may present a challenge for our traditional approaches to politics in a not so distant future. So my 4 points. First, I will address 2 fundamental objections to this goal of mine, that is the adaptation of our Christian message to current global political developments. So these 2 objections are, first, that churches can stay apolitical And second, that no temporal adaptation is needed, as Christ's message, so the argument would go, is universal and unchangeable. So that will be my first intervention. So saying, no, we do have to adapt our message. Second, the second part, I will argue that we as Christians uh, do have some foundational principles of, let's call it Christian politics at our disposal, or Christian global politics at our disposal, that shape our approaches to world politics. But at the same time, these foundational principles do not give us concrete answers. So they don't really tell us exactly what to do or how to react to concrete political questions. Now, third, I will mention some of these new fundamental challenges of our time that I believe we'll have to look at anew: the return of war, great power war in particular, the resurgence of the state, something that is often forgotten, but I think is essential for our understanding of what is happening. But then also, two more points: the impact of these two things, the return of war and the resurgence of the state, on climate change and global inequalities. So these 4 points, I think, are the sort of cluster that we have to look at if we want to understand what is really happening in the world and what is new and requires a new reaction from our side. And then fourth, I will talk a bit about our reactions to these developments, especially in the context of the global resurgence of religion in politics. Now, that might sound a bit surprising, because especially when looking at religion and politics from a European perspective, we might feel that secularization is the main trend, that there is a decrease in religiosity, etc. But in fact, that is, if you look at the data in terms of the presence of religion in the public sphere globally, then what you will see in the last 20 years is a reversal of that trend. So while there is some secularization going on in terms of individual religiosity, religious attendance, etc., on another level, there has been a resurgence of religion. So what does that mean for us as Christians when we want to react to these questions? Let us come back to the question about let's remove the two obstacles that I mentioned at the start. So the question of whether churches need to adapt to current temporal politics at all. Because some people could argue that such an adaptation is not necessary, as Christians, and by extension Christian churches, should remain apolitical. I mean, in a sense, I believe this argument is correct, or on one level, as churches should obviously not endorse concrete politicians in elections or concrete political parties. But in another sense, such an argument is based on what I call the private religion fallacy, as if the Christian faith were a purely private matter that we can or even should hide when acting publicly. um, I'm firmly convinced that Christ's message and the power of divine love transforms the entire human person and our communities, and indeed the whole of creation. Hence, our public engagement should be equally carried by God's love as our privately held convictions. So, no, I don't think that we can state out of politics. Such a position is illusory, I would argue. And I concur here with Pope Francis, who declared famously in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti that politics is one, quote, one of the highest forms of Christian charity. Now, secondly, and that's the second obstacle, second objection, there may be some who would argue that there is no need for adaptation of the Christian message, because the message is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, that it is culture independent and universally valid. Now, there are some core principles, and I'll talk about these core principles in a minute. And these perhaps should be resistant to excessive cultural adaptation. Um, uh, uh, So while there are these principles, I still think that there can be no doubt about the fact that all political stances, and I underline all political stances derived from the Christian faith, are to some extent contextual. So let us just think of the tolerance of slavery historically, or the changing levels of support for democracy among Christian theologians, leaders, and Christians at large, the role of women in politics and in the church, to give just some of the most obvious examples. And of course, this is not a binary category. So at because sort of not only immutable Christianity or a radical cultural adaptation, there is always some gray zone, large gray zone in between. Um, as at the time when slavery was tolerated, other Christians were at the same time sharply critical of the practice. The caste system in India, some churches accepted as a cultural fact, did not actively fight against it, while others at the same time considered caste system or caste distinctions as something fundamentally incompatible with Christianity. So there is always somebody within the Christian family, and I think this is really important, that sees further than others, perhaps than the majority, and who speaks for those oppressed or marginalized. So my second point is that we should be sensitive to these outliers, to these voices, and to the evolution of the political positions we hold, even if we were used to holding those positions for perhaps generations or even longer. In other words, this talk of mine can be understood as a call for us to be on the forefront of this development. Uh, why not be those Christians who raise prophetic voices, who are more sensitive than others to the signs of time, and to the suffering of other beings, even if that means that we are not in a majority in the world, but perhaps even within our own churches. Now, with these obstacles cleared, let me move to the four foundational principles of Christian politics. And I know that this might be controversial for some to talk about Christian politics, and of course we can discuss that later. Um, so these four foundational principles, but also to why I believe that these principles do not give us concrete answers. They sort of nudge us in a direction or give us a sort of broad perspective on issues, but they are sort of more general guidance instead of concrete specific answers. So these four foundational principles, the very core of quote unquote Christian politics, are something that I'm sure you are familiar with. So first, human dignity, and by extension, the sanctity of all life. Genesis 1:27. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Second, love of one's neighbor and especially care for the vulnerable, a principle that is sadly sometimes sidelined by those Christians today who try to reforge an alliance between throne and the altar. Again, Matthew 25, where I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Truly, I say to you, as you did to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. The third foundational principle is justice, the fight for justice and the common good. And again, quote from Isaiah 1:17, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. And finally, peace and reconciliation. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God, as per the Sermon on the Mount. Now, these four foundational principles, and I think we can roughly agree on the four principles, give us the basic material or building material from which the answers to the new challenges we are facing may be built. But while they are the building material, they are not the answers. Now, why is that? Uh, and two possible answers to that. First, the first problem lies in how we should translate these principles to our own context. And of course, there are multiple hundreds of possible translations. So, for instance, when who are the vulnerable we should care for today? Are they migrants, senior citizens, the jobless, the LGBT community, etc.? And the second problem is, of course, that there are contradictions. And that, I think, is an even more serious problem because these contradictions are always present. And I think they cannot be reduced or deleted from our discussion, because always when you have multiple principles, there are clashes of that political values, there are clashes between them. So for instance, if we are asked to be peacemakers, but we are also asked to defend the oppressed and also to seek justice, what are we to do when we are facing a war of aggression, as in the case of our P2P initiative? Are we to prioritize peace at the expense of justice? Are we to defend the vulnerable at the price of delaying peace? So, as you understand, these are not hypothetical questions, but very practical ones, and there is no easy answer to them. So now I finally would like to move to to mentioning the most important changes and transformations of global politics that I believe we as Christians will need to rethink and address anew. I'll mention four as I announced before. So the first of these is the one that is also central for the Pathways to Peace initiative, and that is related to questions of peace and security, and that is the return of war. I mean, one could argue that war is nothing new, but in fact it is, at least in recent times, an attack by a great power against a small neighbor with the intention of territorial conquest. That is something that we have not seen globally since the Second World War. So for 70 plus years. And a great power war in European context, again, something that is entirely novel, something unseen and unheard of in generations. I currently serve, to give you a personal take on this, I currently serve in a commission of the Lutheran World Federation that is tasked with proposing an update and revision of Christian ethics of peace and war. And even though we meet and pray and discuss this matter frequently, this is really a daunting task, because on one hand, we see a continuously growing stress on peace for obvious reasons, and some churches are moving further and further away from the doctrine of the just war, the Catholic Church being one conspicuous example of such a development, or even outright rejecting doctrine, while others are moving in the opposite direction. So, so the most important challenge, I think, is the changed context. Previously, especially during the Cold War, the wars that churches, especially in the West, in the European context, assumed a stance to were typically wars in which their own countries or the United States were involved. So their calls for peace typically targeted their own governments or their government's allies. Now, however, especially in regard to the war in Ukraine, the situation is really significantly different, as we need to rethink our position towards a defensive war. In how far should churches support the invaded country, and in how far should they prioritize peace negotiations? If we talk about just peace, well, as we often do, what is the right balance between the adjective and the noun, between peace and justice? And of course, the most difficult question of all, can one be achieved at the expense of the other? Now, related to that is the second element, the second development, the second big challenge of our time, which you may find perhaps a bit surprising, and that that is the resurgence of the state. Now, we hear all the time about ways in which state sovereignty is being challenged by digitalization, virtualization, new social media, globalization, various transnational actors. But in spite of all that, the state has made a forceful comeback in the last 20 to 30 years. We can see this resurgence of the state quite clearly in the European integration process. A substantial treaty reform that is deepening of the integration has not, has stalled. The last the last substantial reform was the 2007 Lisbon Treaty. So for the last 20 years, no significant deepening. The state-centric forms of populism have been continuously on the rise. Let's have a look at the most recent election to the European Parliament. But it's not only in Europe, about Europe. The most conspicuous recent example is obviously the current United States, because Donald Trump's battle against both immigration and against global trade can be seen as a backlash by the most powerful state in the world, and a sort of attempt to reassert the supremacy of the state over non-state forces. And so far, interestingly, these backlashes seem to be quite successful and very popular in terms of the electoral support as well. So you might ask, why is that relevant from a Christian perspective? And I think it's really very important, essential, in fact, I would argue, from a Christian perspective, because the distinction between citizens and non-citizens that many Christians or Christian churches with a sort of universalist leaning or universalist rhetoric believed would gradually disappear, this distinction, is becoming more and more pronounced. Just a week ago, Donald Trump issued a public proclamation, which you can find on the official website of the president, where he declared the primacy, quote, of national interest in relation to immigrants and refugees. US Vice President J.D. Vance defended this renewed primacy of the state by a reference to Ordo Amoris, to a Christian principle, which can be found in St. Augustine. Pope Francis, who was still alive then, responded with suggesting that everyone who thinks about whom to love first should meditate on the parable about the Good Samaritan. And of course, he was right. And I really like the response by the Pope. But frankly, I'm afraid that J.D. Vance's argument represents a view that is not so uncommon among Christians, and we should take that seriously as well. So this tension between the communitarian and cosmopolitan dimension is here to stay with us, and Christian churches will have to address what I call the communitarian conundrum. What to do with the growing tension between the limited political community, the reassertion of the state on one hand, and their cosmopolitan vision that is, at the moment, politically failing. And third, my third point, the resurgence of the state and the stress on a very narrow understanding of the political community compounds those problems which require a transnational or even a global response. I think we are facing a paradox here of increasingly serious global threats and the more and more palpable withdrawal of states from multilateral cooperation. A concrete example was the COVID pandemics that we still all remember, and the competition between states in terms of vaccine supplies and distribution. But on an even larger scale, this pertains to two interrelated problems of climate change and growing global inequalities. Now, climate change, of course, will impact the whole planet, but it will hit the poorest parts of the world the most. A World Bank study from 2023 found that only 1/10 of the world's greenhouse gases are emitted by 74 lowest income countries. But it will be these countries that will be most affected by the effects of climate change. Now, again, talking about global inequalities, the number of people living in extreme poverty fell by 40% between 2010 and 2019. But since the COVID pandemics, the improvement has stopped and even reversed in some segments of our societies. So by now, 3 years have been lost in the fight against poverty and also in terms of climate change policies. So closing off of countries and the resurgence of the state and the decrease of multilateral cooperation will likely result in an even more dramatic growth of poverty and global inequalities and will hamper the fight against climate change even more. And of course, I could give you many other data on these. External debts have been increasing in all of the global regions over the last decade, and there is no sign of this trend slowing down under these new circumstances. The climate change plus inequality problem will feed back into increased migration. By 2050, at least more than 200 climate refugees will have been replaced, mainly from sub-Saharan Africa and East and South Asia. So there are many more problems which are related to the deterioration of the global geopolitical situation and global multilateral cooperation, such as the tension between sovereignty and the growing digitalization and virtualization of politics, including the virtualization of the public sphere. Another such challenge is the decline of human rights compliance that we see very clearly and that are directly linked to the decline of the global liberal order, including religious freedom, which again is, as I said, a logical consequence of the erosion of these multilateral norms. So what we'll see will be a more fragmented system where the approach might makes right will be employed much more frequently than previously. Again, something that we as Christians will have to address more frequently. But I want to stop here and mention just one final development that we as Christians should pay particular attention to. All of the above trends are taking place in the context of the global resurgence of religion that I was mentioning at the beginning of my talk. Now, you might think that this is a good thing, since the resurgence of religion means that religious actors, such as churches, will be more listened to. And to some extent, you may be right that there are shifts towards a bit more listening to religious actors than before, even in regions with high levels of secularization, such as Europe. But I believe that this resurgence is a double-edged sword, to say the least. Often, religion is employed in politics by actors who do not really subscribe to the four foundational principles that I described, Christian principles that I described above. We can conduct a simple experiment. How often do people who talk about the defense of traditional Christian values care preferentially for the poor, marginalized, and vulnerable? How often do they talk about, or do they talk more about loving one's neighbor or about seeing the other as a threat that we need to protect ourselves from? And I want to make a reference to a recent book here by a colleague, esteemed colleague of mine, Tobias Kramer. The book is called The Godless Crusade. And the book argues that many political movements have recently adopted Christian symbolism for strategic purposes without any reference to core Christian beliefs or practices, such as charity or solidarity or forgiveness. For them, Christianity in politics becomes an identity marker, an us versus them, a tool of division. But And I think that is really vital. Kramer also shows that these attempts at repurposing Christianity fail if religious communities and religious leaders publicly reject the misuse of these Christian symbols and instead defend these foundational Christian principles, the Christian commandment of love of one's neighbor. So let me conclude by saying that against the currently rising forces of apocalypticism, we Christians, I believe, are called to live the good news, to proclaim interconnectedness, universal brotherhood and sisterhood in Christ against isolation, solidarity against indifference, and hope against despair. Walter Brueggemann, a theologian who influenced me deeply and who, as you know, passed away last week, wrote in his famous book, The Prophetic Imagination, quote, "Hope is an absurdity too embarrassing to speak about, for it flies in the face of all those claims we have been told are facts. Hope is the refusal to accept the reading of reality, which is the majority opinion. And one does that only at great political and existential risk. Hope is also subversive, for it limits the grandiose pretension of the present, daring to announce that the present is called into question." Thank you.